Let me ask you a question. What does innovation mean to you? Because it can mean many things to many people. Efficiency, creativity, robots. But what is the root of innovation? Intelligence, experience. How about courage? Because it takes courage to innovate, to speak up and speak out, to put your head above the parapet and say, what if we did this way? The world is changing more rapidly now than ever before, and it's our duty to meet those changes with confidence. So let's explore, participate, and collaborate, because together we can face these challenges and create opportunities to develop better public services and a better Ireland for everyone. We're a public service of over 340,000 people from all walks of life across hundreds of disciplines. And it's this diversity that gives us our strength, from education and health to justice and defence, from local government to civil service and state bodies. Regardless of age, gender or grade, we all make a difference and we can all innovate. And so we invite you to have the courage to innovate with us. Maybe there's a better way of doing things. So be curious, ask the question, start the conversation. Whether you're in your role for 30 years or 30 days, everyone has a part to play. We are many and we are one. So let's take this step together.
Good morning, everybody, and you're all very, very welcome to our innovation event, our opening event for Innovation Week this year in 2020. As you know, last year we saw our first public service-wide Innovation Week, and we had a magnificent week with over 600 different events across the public service, showcasing all that we do in the public service and showcasing innovation. And this year, we have moved our event online, and we hope that it's going to surpass everything that we did last year. And I suppose this year in particular, because of the situation that we're in at the moment and the current COVID crisis, there is a need more than ever for us to be innovative in delivering our services to the public, in looking at the way we do things in our organisations, and making sure that all our staff are fully engaged and fully involved in innovating and providing our services and improving everything that we do. So I'm delighted to welcome you all this morning, and I'm really looking forward to the week and looking forward to this first event this morning. But I might start by introducing you to a video from our new Minister, our Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, Mr. Michael McGrath. So we'll play that now for you first.
Over the last 6 months, we have witnessed the enormous commitment and dedication of our public servants in responding to the crisis, whether it be on the front line or, importantly, ensuring continuity of services for the public. And I salute each and every one of you for playing your part in this. As we begin to develop the next public service reform programme, it is critical to consider future challenges and the megatrends coming our way. Complex and challenging events connected to health, climate change, geopolitical situations and other quickly developing issues are likely to emerge, and as these issues materialise, we must ensure that we are in a position to maintain the public services that people rely on. We refine our crisis management planning to allow us to respond quickly and innovatively when issues arise. The next reform framework needs to reflect what the world will look like in 2030. The challenges and opportunities we may face, and the capabilities we will need as a public service to effectively navigate this new world. We need to future-proof our policies and embrace innovation as the expectation rather than the exception. How citizens perceive and interact with public institutions is changing. They expect more transparency, better accountability, and a voice in decision-making. More and more citizens will be involved in the co-creation and testing of our public policies and services. This citizen-centric partnership approach will result in better designed services and greater citizen satisfaction. Innovation Week provides us with a fantastic opportunity to highlight the importance of the role of innovation in the public service. It allows us to explore great stories of innovation in Ireland and further afield. I would encourage you to attend the various sessions, and no doubt you'll feel inspired and determined to innovate in your own roles and organisations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much from our Minister, and I think I'd like to reassure you that our Minister is very supportive of the innovative work of the public service, and you have heard him on a number of occasions, I suppose, commending the great work and the great innovations that have happened right across our public service over the last 7 months, and encouraging us to continue. So now, just to move on, we're delighted that Robert Watt, our Secretary General from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, is with us this morning. And Robert is an extremely busy man, as you can imagine, in the middle of all of this. So Robert is just going to open and just say a few words to open Innovation Week for 2020. Robert.
Thank you, Breda. I hope you can hear me. Apologies, I was meant to join you earlier, but since we are operating in a world of such uncertainty, it also applies to our diaries over here. So apologies that I had to jump into something else. And I just wanted to join the call, and apologies to Peter for cutting across Peter's session, which seems very interesting. But I just wanted to, at the start, acknowledge all our colleagues who are involved in this Innovation Week and all the work they're putting in. I know the way in which we're doing this year is different to last year. And we have to make it as good as we possibly can. And the programme looks very interesting and very challenging, and I hope colleagues get something out of it. I think, so again, to thank everybody who's involved in organising the event. I think these sort of events, I think they're important about showcasing what we're doing, showcasing best and excellence in policy development or in policy delivery, sharing stories and examples of progress. I think those stories are really important. And to pick up one of Peter's points about trying to communicate the stories of what's working and what's not working is really important, because there's much doubt, lots of doubt in many policy areas. And when we see colleagues in different settings grappling with comparable challenges and being upfront about what's not working, I think sharing those stories can really help in terms of moving the dial and moving policy in a different direction. But I think the great value of this conference is to try to spend time thinking. My own morning is an example of how the immediate can push out time for strategic thinking and time for reflection. But it is hopefully an opportunity for people this week to spend some time away from the day-to-day, what they're doing all the time, to actually stand back and think about the direction of their work, think about what they're doing and what contribution they're making. And I think uncertainty seems to be a theme of all the conversations we're having at the moment. And I think the older I'm getting, the less certain I am about things. Some people tend to go in the opposite direction and become increasingly certain about how they see the world. But the more evidence I see of things and how the world evolves and adapts, and how behaviour, and human behaviour also evolves and adapts, I'm less certain about our responses to problems. I'm less certain about how we should. And there are many debates. I'll give you one example. In macroeconomics, over the years, if we'd said we were able to increase the money supply as much as we have been able to do and keep interest rates as low as they are and have been for some time now, without a massive increase in the price level, people would have found this impossible to believe, given the way we looked at macroeconomics in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And I think Peter's point is well made about doubt and about research might be about increasing more doubt. But I think it does ultimately enable us to have more frank conversations and more open conversations. And from that, we hopefully can get into a better place and make better decisions. I think just a few comments about innovation. I think innovation is critical in normal times for us to deliver better services, to do things differently, to deliver more services with the same amount of resource or the same service with low resource. We need to be innovative and also to get better outcomes. So I think that's a critical part of the role, I think, of civil and public servants, is to have innovation at the centre of what we all do and to create an innovation culture. And I think the innovation culture perhaps is the most important, is to reward success and reward people who do things differently, but also to shield people and support people when they do something different, but it doesn't work out. And that not working out in our world, as we know, might involve a public conversation, might involve critical media commentary or other commentary. And I think it's very important for leaders to provide that supportive environment, that culture of support. So we really do evolve into much more of a learning culture as opposed to a gotcha culture. I think innovation is a critical part of that. In terms of the challenges we're all facing, how do we deliver services in this environment? I know there'll be many conversations this week about this around different channels of delivery, particularly about digitalisation, and it is fantastic to see so many things that we were told, particularly in the health system, could not be done, which have been done now over the last 6 months. And I think the challenge for us is to retain the benefits of some of those new innovative ways of delivering services for customers and for people who provide the services, but to retain them well beyond when this COVID challenge is no longer with us and we're talking about something else. I think data and use of data and ensuring that data can help us make the right decisions, I think is really critical. And I'm struck in relation to COVID, and Peter's on the various groups helping government formulate the policy, but how we have so much data and how to try to get the key insights and to present that data in a way which actually helps the policymakers who are making decisions very quickly in responding to moving events. I think that is really important. In relation to COVID, this wave, if that's the right way to describe it, the wave of the disease, the second instance of disease, is very different to the first wave. We have more cases, in part no doubt because we're doing more testing, but there is a weaker relationship between new cases and hospitalizations and numbers of people in ICU and deaths. And what does that mean for policy, particularly when you look at the data on an age-specific basis? So as we're debating COVID and where we go now, the use of data and up-to-date data can have a profound impact in terms of how the government will respond. And within this general area of COVID and uncertainty, it's really the decision-making under uncertainty and the lessons, the decision-making tree and how we actually make decisions. And a key part of it is for us to, when we're making decisions, is to really understand what we don't know or to admit what we don't know, to admit, as Peter mentioned, that we have been wrong and that many of the assumptions we had actually don't hold true. And I think that's really important for us to embrace the notion of us making decisions in a sensible way with all this uncertainty. So to sum up, I think the world is very different. The challenges we face are very differently, and for that we have to act differently and we have to think differently. And I hope that can be a theme of this week, where people will really have an opportunity to reflect in a different way about the challenges they face, to reflect differently and think differently, and then ultimately advise and act differently. So I'll finish up there, and apologies, Breda, and for the team for missing the earlier start and for cutting across the session with Lucy and Peter. But I just wanted to come on board to wish everybody all the best for this week. It looks like a great programme, and once again to thank Lucy and her team for all the organisation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. We're delighted to have had you on board.
So now this morning, I'm delighted to be here to introduce Professor Pete Lunn, who is the founder and the head of the Behavioural Research Unit in the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute. And you've probably heard Pete on the airwaves and in the public domain quite a lot over the last number of months, because he has been very much involved in the COVID, in managing the COVID crisis. And at the beginning of the present pandemic, Pete was appointed to the behavioural change subgroup of NEFIT. And his team have conducted multiple behavioural studies over the past 6 months, designed to improve public communication and to target better the communications and to influence behaviours in response to the COVID crisis. So we're very fortunate to have Pete with us this morning. So I'll hand over to you now, Pete, and look forward very much to your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, and good morning to everybody. We certainly do live in a world of innovation where I can find myself addressing 400 public servants from my bedroom, but that's what we have been confined to during this current pandemic. I'm going to tell you more about other behavioural innovations that have taken place during the pandemic. I'm assuming my slides are going to appear. Great stuff. There they are. Okay, so everything seems to be working seamlessly. Just to say, I was asked to do this keynote this morning, and I'm more than happy to. In fact, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to do that. But I was very conscious that listening to people for an extended period online is pre-taxing. So I wanted to make it as conversational as I can. So I'm going to talk to you for around half an hour or so. That leaves plenty of time for questions and discussion, and I've been asked to encourage you to use the chat function and to put questions up there so that we can get more of a dialogue going, because my experience of trying to convey some of the ideas I'm going to try to convey to you this morning is that dialogue is a really important part of that. So please, if you have any questions, and in particular, if anything that I say strikes you as being nonsense, it just doesn't fit with your worldview, it doesn't seem to make any sense. I mean, obviously formulate a question first, but please do fire in a question and raise exactly the point you want to raise, and I'll see if I can deal with it at the end. Okay, so my first slide there has a picture of the Behavioural Research Unit at the ESRI. 7 years ago, in 2013, we started that unit. It was just me and one research assistant at the time. We're now a unit of 8. We're actually still expanding. And we now do work with somewhere around a dozen departments and state agencies where we apply behavioural science directly to policy. And I'm going to explain precisely what I mean by that. And that is the innovation I'm going to be talking about this morning. That's what I know about. And that is an innovation in the public service. In fact, internationally it is. It's only really in the last 10 years that applied behavioural science has been used directly in policy applications. And one thing to say right from the start is that Ireland is not a follower in this. We're not the absolute pioneers. The UK were the first to really do it, but Ireland is certainly an early adopter and one of, I wouldn't go quite as far as world leaders, but certainly an early adopter and an innovator internationally in terms of how we do this kind of work. So we're not slavishly following, we're actually pushing the boundaries internationally. And my unit there at the ESRI is not the only unit that's applying behavioural science to policy in Ireland. SEAI has its own unit, particularly obviously looking at things like retrofitting and energy usage, domestic energy usage, and also energy usage in SMEs. There's a group at UCD doing quite a lot of applied work, again, some of it in the energy space. And Revenue for some time have also been using behavioural science to increase the amount of tax revenue that's brought in. So we're not the only group doing it, but we are Ireland's largest. What I'm going to tell you about this morning really is the work that we do has accelerated greatly due to COVID. And I'm going to tell you just a couple of slides with a little bit of background about what happened prior to that. And then mostly I'm going to concentrate on giving you some examples of the work we've done due to COVID, because I think there are lessons and I think they are instructive for how we use behavioural science and what it's able to do and not do in terms of policy development and implementation. So that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. Okay, let me see if my clicker is going to work for me. There it goes, great. Okay, the primary thing that behavioural science, I'm just going to give you a couple of slides here on more generally how behavioural science is changing aspects of policy development, where it is being used. And the primary thing that behavioural science has done is it's introduced experiments into the development of public policy. Now, what an experiment really can do for you is, instead of having to make assumptions about how people behave, or even just asking people what they want or what would help them or how they would respond to things, instead of making those assumptions and doing it that way, you can actually genuinely test it, and you can test it using an experiment. And much of the kind of advance of behavioural science for policy has borrowed from the randomized controlled trial that's been so successful in clinical medicine and also in behavioural medicine, actually, where we take a sample of people and we randomly assign them to conditions. So one group will get randomly assigned, you can see it there in the diagram, to a control group, we're calling it their group 1. The others will get randomly assigned to group 2, where they will get some kind of behaviorally informed intervention. That intervention might not be a policy intervention. We might just be, for example, changing the framing of how somebody sees a particular choice or a particular problem that they have to grapple with, or maybe even as simple actually as an online public service interface where people are being asked to make decisions or asked to provide information and so on. So one group gets the control, which is quite often the way it's done now, and another group gets a different image that's informed by behavioral science, or a different set of information, or a framing of the problem, or whatever it happens to be. And what we then do is we compare the outcomes there, and you can see there might be a target outcome. That's my little green people there. And what we're doing is we're comparing whether we get the target outcome more among group 2 than we do group 1. If we do, where there's a random split, and I've circled that in red because that's really, really important. If we do, exactly as in a clinical trial in medicine, what we assume there is, because the only difference between those two groups is the difference that we made between the way we presented the information to group 1 and group 2, because that's the only difference. We can very confidently say that's what's driving people's behavior, that if we see different behaviors or different decisions in group 2 than we see in group 1, we know that what we did, because we randomly assigned people to these conditions, and we carefully control what we showed them in each condition, we can be very confident that what we've done has made a difference. And we can measure the size of that difference too. So behavioral scientists exploit the power of these kind of randomized controlled trials. My group and many other groups around the world do this in predominantly 3 different ways. So we run field experiments where we actually have the intervention trialed in the field, and we measure real outcomes for the real policy area that we're interested in. We will do lab experiments sometimes where we actually pull groups of people into a controlled laboratory environment, and we get them to make decisions and carry out behaviors within that controlled environment. And we, just as this diagram suggests, we manipulate the information that's available to them, and we see what difference it makes to their behavior. And now increasingly we do work online, where we have people doing online experiments with us. And I'm going to give examples of that because, of course, during COVID, we were primarily confined to doing online experiments, and we had to be more innovative and creative in how we went about them. And I'm going to give you examples of that shortly. Before I do that, just 3 quick... Sorry, advance the slide. My phone is misbehaving on me now. Thanks very much. So 3 quick pre-COVID examples just to kind of nail the point of how we go about doing this sort of work. And so for those of you who were at the Innovation Conference last year, I covered a couple of these last year, and I'm only going to briefly talk about them here. So the first one was a laboratory experiment we did on calorie posting, where we pre-tested the government's calorie posting legislation effectively. And we did that in a laboratory setting where people came in, and while they were doing other things within this laboratory setting, they ordered lunch from an online menu, not knowing that that was part of an experiment. And what we did was we systematically manipulated whether they saw calorie information on the menu, on an online menu, and if they saw calorie information, how exactly the calorie information was presented and where. And what we found was, first of all, that presenting calorie information on an online menu makes a real difference. We got a large difference in not just what people ordered, but how much of it they ate. So people ordered fewer calories and ate fewer calories if calorie information was provided on an online menu. But interestingly, we found that where exactly the calorie information was presented made a really big difference. Where exactly it was on the menu, in what format, and where it was spatially located compared to the price. That came actually as a real surprise to us. We weren't expecting to see that. And one of the reasons you do these kind of experiments is precisely because you can generate surprising results that only after you've seen them and you've thought more deeply about them and questioned your own assumptions, do you then realize that the world is more complex than you thought, and that there are things going on that had not occurred to you until you did the experiment. And that was a classic example of that. So that's a kind of lab experiment we might do. Second example on that slide is a field experiment we've done with nitrate pollution on Irish farms, where we randomized farms to receive different regulatory communication. They were actually penalty notices for people who had too much nitrate pollution on the farms. There are EU limits for how much nitrate you can have per hectare on an Irish farm. And the penalty notices, we randomly assigned people to receive different penalty notices, the farmers who had transgressed in one year, and then measured the likelihood that they transgressed in the next year, depending whether they got the simplified regulatory notices. And it turned out that we reduced nitrate pollution on Irish farms by simplifying. That was all we did. Simply by simplifying the information that we gave people in the penalty notice letters, we managed to reduce the amount of nitrate pollution the following year. Again, that was a surprise to us. We thought some of the more persuasive messaging we were trying to use would be more effective. And actually, it turned out that the mere process of simplifying the regulatory communication was enough to improve behavior, probably suggesting actually that the previous communications were being disregarded because they were too complex or not properly understood. And when we simplified the information for farmers, it had an effect on their behavior the following year. So that's an example of a field experiment where we do something, as it were, kind of live in situ in the field, in this case, literally in a field. And then we have studies that we might do online. So we might run experiments online where people log into an online portal. And again, we randomly assign them to different conditions and we have them make decisions and give us responses online. And I'm going to show you more examples of this in relation to COVID shortly. But an example we did prior to COVID was we tested for Comreg people's susceptibility to different kinds of broadband speed advertising. So Comreg were concerned that there were expressions that were being used in the marketing that might be very misleading, some of them being meaningful and some not. So you could get turbo-powered broadband, you could get lightning broadband, you could get fiber-powered broadband, you could get super-fast broadband. How were consumers responding to these? Were they paying extra for stuff that sounded good but was actually vacuous? Could they really recognize when they were genuinely paying for additional speed? And we ran an online experiment where we had people choosing broadband packages online, and we systematically manipulated randomly for different consumers. We systematically manipulated how they saw the advertising and how the different packages were described. And sure enough, that experiment proved that people genuinely are susceptible to this kind of advertising, and we could push them to pay more for things that were not actually delivering genuine value by describing them in ways that we could see are being described in the market. And in that, we also tested a little intervention too. So we had a multi-stage experiment where we first tested people's susceptibility, and then we gave them some information to read that was kind of one-page primer on broadband speed, and we tested that primer to see whether it improved their decision-making and whether they could work out which were the better value packages that were genuinely offering some speed. So that's an example of us being able to do experiments in the lab with the calorie posting study, in the field where we're actually sending real letters to farmers who have transgressed and then measuring their behavior the following year. And then online, where we are testing people's susceptibility to a kind of advertising when they're making online choices. And the online case there is actually very realistic, of course, because most people would be typically buying these kind of services online these days too. Now, in that grey box there underneath those three examples, you'll see that I'm going to make a comparison between different types of experiments. So one of the things that we've learned as we've applied behavioral science more to policy is that there's a sort of spectrum that an experiment might sit on, where at one end it might be purely diagnostic, where what we're really doing is trying to understand what drives people's behavior. So we're not testing any kind of policy intervention. We're simply presenting information in different ways or exposing people to different environments and seeing what difference does it make, and what does that tell us about how behavior works, about what is driving people's behavior, what do they respond to, what changes their behavior or changes their decisions. And that's a diagnostic experiment. They can be really, really useful because they can help you to understand, if you know what's driving people's behavior, what kind of policy interventions are most likely to work and which ones are not. And they might make you question your assumptions about why people behave the way they do. So that's a kind of diagnostic study. And then we go all the way to actually, we may not learn a huge amount diagnostically about what's driving people's behavior, but what we find out is, does a particular specific intervention work? So if I write a letter one way, and we'll call it letter B, that has an intervention in it, and I write it another way, we'll call it letter A. There may be multiple differences between the two letters. I might not know which differences change behavior, but if I see behaviors changed by one letter compared to the other, then I know that intervention has worked, that the new letter has worked, even if I don't know exactly how it's worked. So you have a kind of spectrum going all the way from diagnostic experiments that tell you what's driving behavior, what's causing what, to pure intervention ones where you might get some insight into what's driving what, but all you're really getting primarily is, does this work? Do I get better outcomes if I do it method B compared to method A? I'm going to come back to that as we go on. So if we could advance the slide again. Thank you. So moving on to the COVID stuff. I think in Ireland, we actually harness behavioural science for the effort to fight COVID as well as I've seen in any other country. You can imagine nerds like me have kind of international networks of nerds who do the same kind of stuff that I do in different countries. And talking to all of them, I think we managed to get a lot of behavioural science, particularly in the early phase of our response, into the way we were trying to manage the crisis. That was done via this behavioural change subgroup that was mentioned in the introduction, which was highly active. I mean, we met every week from mid-March. And my team was only part of that. And I just want to reference some of the work that was done there because I think it tells you how far we've come. I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think this group would have been formed. I don't think the expertise on it would have existed to form it, even if you wanted to. Things really have changed in terms of our understanding of the importance of behavioral science for responding to a big public health problem like this. So immediately we got this group got tracking surveys up and running that were tracking people's behavior on a weekly basis and also how they were feeling, how their well-being was doing, how they were responding to the messaging, whether they supported more or fewer restrictions. A series of questions that were being asked week after week and tracking the population. We did the usual kind of stuff on focus groups, but also social media monitoring. There's a very good well-being study done by UCD, which I've quoted many times because it really underscored the scale of what we were dealing with. UCD ran a study there, Liam Delaney's group at UCD, where they used a method that had been used in Ireland before. So we could very clearly see how big was the well-being loss due to COVID. And the way this works is a kind of diary method where you have people recording how they feel and their emotions over a day. And you probe that using a technique that behavioral scientists have developed. And when we did that, you could see that the well-being loss due to COVID, when this was measured back in April, was as big as if the entire population had been made simultaneously unemployed. It's a really, really good study. And it also showed that hit was substantially larger for younger people. So a very good study. There were other studies done, one by UL, another by ICAD, that were kind of good studies tracking people's compliance behavior and so on. There was a business survey done by the SEAI team where they looked at people's readiness to install nudges and interventions to try to get businesses reopen more safely and have people using sanitizer and using proper barriers and markings on the floor and all this kind of stuff. And then we did a whole series of online behavioral studies. The Behavioral Research Unit of the ESRI did, that's my group. So I'm going to show you 3 examples now to give you an idea of the kind of studies we did and what we've learned from doing them. So this was hugely accelerated. In fact, we did 7 studies in 4 months. And we would normally, our usual turnaround time for doing a study for policymakers would be maybe 3 to 4 months from the time we've agreed the right research question, what we're really going to tackle, to actually carrying out the experiment, analysing the data and giving results. Normally we'd take 3 to 4 months. In this case, we actually undertook 7 studies in the space of 4 months. I'm going to give you 3 examples here. Some of the stuff I'm not going to talk about, we pre-tested the contact tracing. We actually ran an experiment where we pre-tested it. That's very complex and quite technical. I'm not going to talk about it, but I do genuinely think that it improved the download rate for the contact tracing app by changing the way the data privacy notices were framed and formatted to make people feel more comfortable and understand better how their data was being used. We've also done a study on people's understanding of the test and trace system, and another one just prior to the roadmap. We did a very detailed measure of the Irish population's expectations and how much they'd learned about COVID so far and what they thought was going to happen over coming months that informed the original roadmap. I'm not going to talk about those studies. I'm going to talk about 3 others, which I think give an example of the kind of work that we can now do, and I think have broader lessons for how we can use this kind of science in multiple policy areas well beyond COVID, and hopefully after we've got out of this crisis. Fingers crossed. Okay, so if I could get the next slide, please. So the first example I'm going to give you is a very simple experiment that we did early on to try to promote social distancing. Essentially, the way it worked was this, that we used an online interface. People logged in online and they saw one of 3 posters. And they thought what we were doing was essentially just road testing some posters. And saying, what do you think of this? Do you think it's good? So they randomly saw one of the 3 posters. I'll show you them in a little more detail in a moment. And we measured whether people thought these posters were any good. We said, are they effective? Do you think they'd be memorable? And then later on in the same study, in a different stage of the study, so not directly related to these posters that our participants could see, we asked them questions about their plans for the coming days, what they were going to get up to, what they were planning to do in terms of their own behavior, and also the acceptability of certain behaviors. Whether they thought some things were okay or not okay, given the way the restrictions were at the time. And what we were actually doing in this experiment was trying to see whether the poster that we'd shown them earlier in their online session had had some kind of real impact on their own plans for their own behavior, and whether they thought certain behaviors were or were not acceptable. So that's what this experiment was about. It's a simple enough online experiment. And if I could get the next slide, please. So this was the control poster. You might recognize this. This was in use at the time. It was the standard HSE poster that was out and about trying to tell people in different environments to maintain their 2-meter social distance. So that was our control group, and a third of our participants were randomly assigned to view that poster and then gave us some scores for how good they thought the poster was. Did they think it would be effective? Did they think it would be memorable? We then compared that with the first treatment poster. So if I could get the next slide. Now, this poster used a thing called the identifiable victim effect, which comes from experimental psychology, actually. It was first studied back in the 1990s. And the idea here is that if you identify a specific victim when you're trying to persuade somebody to avoid some kind of harm, the identification of the specific victim is highly persuasive. So that's what the psychological literature showed us. Now, this slide's pretty small on my screen, and I'm going to guess it's probably pretty small on yours too, but let me give you an idea how this worked. So it had 4 panels, as you can see, and in each one of them there were thought bubbles. And if you take the top one there, the top right one there, you can see that one of the thought bubbles comes from a person saying, well, doesn't think she has it. And the one below says, I think it says, will infect her sister, she's a doctor. And in each of the 4 bubbles, there was a specific person who's a vulnerable person or a frontline worker who's going to end up getting infected. So in one of them, it's a grandmother. In one of them, it's an asthmatic, a dad who's an asthmatic. And as you can see, all the people in these posters are not socially distancing appropriately. And the bubbles are telling a little, one person doesn't realize they're actually carrying the disease. They infect somebody else who's going to infect a vulnerable person. So there's a story there that has this kind of, we're going to call this the emotion condition, that uses the identifiable victim effect. Now, a really important point about this experiment is this poster is not a very good poster. And anyone who's done any social marketing will see that. It's not a very good poster because it's actually showing examples of the behavior you don't want rather than the behavior you do want. And it's also not a particularly attractive poster. It's not particularly catchily designed. That's done on purpose because what we're trying to do here is identify whether this mechanism works. So we didn't want the poster to be superficially just a much nattier looking poster, something that just looks a bit cooler and is going to work anyway. We wanted a poster that, if anything, was a little bit clunky compared to the control condition, but had the mechanism that we were interested in, which is if we used this identifiable victim effect, would it have an influence on people's plans for coming days and what they thought was acceptable behavior? So in this case, the identifiable victim effect, and at the bottom it says small changes will save the people we care about. So we've got our 4 identifiable victims in the 4 panels, and that was the emotion poster. If you give me an animate, I'll show you the 3rd condition. So next slide, please. And this one is an exponential transmission poster. We're going to call this the efficacy poster. So what happened in this case was we were trying to get across to people that one single infection could downstream lead to very many infections because, and we hear it all the time, this idea of exponential growth. Exponential growth does not mean there's a very, very high number of cases, as you often hear it used. What it means is that the spread of the cases accelerates. That 1 affect 3, affect 9, affect 27, and so on. That's exponential growth. And we designed this poster exactly the same pictures. Again, it's not a particularly snazzy looking poster, but the story in the thought bubbles is, for example, that 1 person affects 3 people who then affect 9 people, then 27. It was trying to get across the idea that you could be the 1 person who breaks a chain that otherwise leads to the spread of this infection. And at the bottom there, it says small changes will make a big difference. So we're going to call this the efficacy poster. So The design of the experiment, pretty simple. You're randomized to see one of the three posters. You see a control poster, you see the emotion poster that identifies victims, and you see the efficacy poster that makes a point of the fact that one person can lead to downstream infections of very many others. These were seen early in the session, as I said, and then we asked the behavioural questions later, separated from the poster, after people had given their initial poster evaluation. So I'll show you the results. If I can give you if we can get the next slide. Okay, so people didn't like our posters. How effective do you think this post would be at promoting social distancing? You can see the control condition outperforms both the emotion and the efficacy poster. These are statistically significant differences. How memorable do you think this poster campaign would be? Not very. So people didn't like our posters. In a way, that's exactly what we wanted, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to test the effectiveness of the mechanism we've buried in the poster, not the superficial attractiveness or characteristics of the poster, as I've said. So the initial responses to are these good posters? Answer, no, people didn't like them. But what happened later in the session when we looked at their likely behavior? Next slide, please. If I can get the next slide, if that's possible. It's disappeared. There should be one in between the two. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so they didn't like the posters, but I'm delighted this slide appeared, because if it hadn't, it would have been very difficult to persuade you of this. They work better. And you can see that here. So the control poster is in blue, the emotion poster with the identifiable victim effect is in orange, and the efficacy poster about exponential infection is in grey. And what you're looking at there is three categories of what we call caution. So we ask people multiple questions about their planned behaviour for coming days, and whether they thought, that's the responses on the left, and whether they thought actions, particular behaviours were acceptable. Those are the responses on the right. And we categorize those responses into three, into people who are highly cautious about social distancing and how many people they were going to meet and in what circumstances, people who had medium levels of caution, and people who had low levels of caution. So if you look at the chart on the left there, when it was people's own actions, and we're saying, what are you going to do over the next 2 or 3 days? The people who've been exposed to the emotion, but particularly the efficacy poster there, told us that they were going to be more cautious in coming days about how many people they were going to meet, where they were going to meet them, who they were going to meet, and so on. When we asked them about the acceptability of behaviours, that's the right-hand chart there. So we said, if somebody, for example, allows their children to play with the neighbour's children, is that okay or not? Please rate its acceptability. We have multiple questions like this. And when we asked about the acceptability of behaviours, again, people who earlier in the session had been exposed to the efficacy and the emotion posters gave us more highly cautious responses, saying that no, these behaviours weren't acceptable and people needed to be more cautious than this. So what we can see from this is that purely by randomizing people to see these different posters, we get a different effect on their psychology regarding social distancing and their willingness to engage in social distancing themselves and what they deem to be acceptable social distancing as well. So the crucial thing to understand here is that this, while it did test an intervention, that was not the primary purpose. The primary purpose was diagnostic. The intervention that we tested was a not very good poster, but buried within it was a message we thought would be really quite effective. And what the experiment does is it shows that that's the case. So that message did end up coming out in multiple communications from the public health teams in all sorts of different forms. And it also, interestingly, we got a kind of triangulation of evidence with other evidence that we knew from surveys, which was people saying the thing they were most worried about was handing this disease on to others. It wasn't so much the effect it might have on themselves. So this experiment helped to cement that message and helped to show that particular kinds of messaging showing that you could be the person who cuts a chain of quite large downstream infection, or prevents identifiable vulnerable people from being infected, was a more effective message in terms of getting at people's at least their behavioral intentions and attitudes. Obviously, we didn't measure absolute pure behavior here. We measured what people were planning to do over coming days. Okay, so that's the first study I wanted to show you, which had that kind of diagnostic test buried within it. Next slide, please. So this one is one where we're much more doing a pre-test here, where we're testing materials. What happened here was that people randomly saw materials presented in different ways. And in this case, what we were particularly interested in was issues to do with recognizing patterns of symptoms and people's willingness to self-isolate, their understanding of what they needed to do to self-isolate, and their confidence in doing it. So we're really interested in what happens to somebody who first suspects that they might unfortunately have COVID or that someone in their household might. And what we did was we randomized to see people to see the information presented in different ways. So again, this is an online experiment, and we have people randomly looking at different kinds of information. I'm going to show you more detailed examples in a moment, but essentially we have people looking at tables. Now you'll recognize obviously the COVID branding there. We have people looking at tables as they were presented in the original booklet that was sent to households, and we compared that with a behaviorally informed intervention where we have people looking at decision trees, and I'll show you an example of a decision tree in a moment. We also compare lists of behaviors for what you're supposed to do to self-isolate if you're in a household that needs to self-isolate, and the booklet contained these are the behaviors that you need to do. We're going to compare that with some behaviorally informed infographics. And what we then did was we tested people. So we exposed people to different communications, different information communications, and then we tested how people would respond to different symptom patterns in terms of if I had these symptoms, what would I do? Would I self-isolate? Would I call the GP or not? And we also tested their recall and understanding of some of the information. So what we're directly doing here is we're testing whether providing the information in different ways has a bigger impact on people's understanding of what they're supposed to do, their recall of the information. Okay, so if I can get the next slide, please. So we randomly assigned some people to see this. This is the table of symptoms that was provided in the booklet that was sent to every household by the HSE that told you if you got particular patterns of symptoms, what you needed to do. And I'm not going to go through all of these bullet points in detail here. You'll have seen this before anyway. This was taken from what was online on the HSE website and what was put in the booklet. So these original tables, and this is what you need to do to restrict your movements further or to self-isolate if you have particular symptoms. And it compared coronavirus symptoms with cold and flu symptoms. So next slide, please. If I could get the next slide, please. Brilliant. No, we've skipped one again, I'm afraid. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we compared that table with a decision tree. This is a decision tree. This organizes exactly the same information into a flowchart where you can see it says start here. Do you have any of the following symptoms? Cough, fever, shortness of breath? Yes, you should be self-isolating. No, go to the next question. And it lays out exactly the same information that was on the previous slide, but it does it in these things called a decision tree, which behavioral scientists have previously tested. In some contexts, not all, seem to be more effective. So what we're doing here is we're saying, look, this intervention that's proved more effective in some other contexts, including some public health contexts, if we experiment on it, is it going to be more effective in this context where we're dealing with the COVID symptom pattern? And what we did was we randomly assigned half the people to see the original table and half the people to see the decision tree. And then we gave them different symptom patterns, and we said, right, if you got these symptoms, what would you need to do? Would you need to self-isolate? Would you need to restrict your movements? Could you carry on as normal? And we had people make decisions, and we could see which of the interventions help people to make better decisions. Next slide, please. Now, on this occasion, I'm not going to show you the data because it's quite complex and I don't really have time, but the results were very, very straightforward. I put a big green tick on the decision tree there. Why? Because when people saw the decision tree, they then became better at making the decision. They became better at knowing when they needed to self-isolate or restrict their movements compared to carrying on as normal, compared to if they saw the tabulated form that had been previously in use. So one of the results of this was that these kind of decision trees were pushed out on social media. One of them was introduced on a website and so on, where we are then trying to use these decision trees to help people if they go looking for information, if they're experiencing any kind of symptoms, to make a good decision. Interestingly, these decision trees actually got picked up by public health agencies in other countries as well. So this research spread to bits of Public Health England and other places where they started using some of these interventions too. Something else happened in this study that's worth mentioning. So sure, this was a pre-test. This was not supposed to be a diagnostic study. We simply wanted to know which of these interventions was more likely to get people to make good decisions if different symptoms presented of COVID. But we also found something else. We found that their general performance was pretty poor compared to what you might have thought it should be. People were quite good at recognizing the main COVID symptoms, but were really not great at realizing that when they had what were called secondary symptoms, other flu-like symptoms that were not the direct COVID symptoms of fever and dry cough, but might be things to do with like headaches and fatigue, and sore throat and so on, things that they might typically associate with a heavy cold or with flu. They were not as good at recognizing with those kind of symptoms when they needed to self-isolate. So in the end, this study also threw up a surprise where the public health teams thought that was a message that had got across clearly, that if you had any flu-like symptoms at all, you needed to be self-isolating. In fact, our study suggested that while people were very good when they got the main COVID symptoms, with the secondary flu-like symptoms, they were far less likely to recognize the need to self-isolate and call the GP. So this study ended up throwing up that as a surprise, that it measured an absolute level of performance that was a concern. So it had some diagnostic value too, and more effort was then put into stressing the importance of self-isolation and calling the GP in the event you got a more unusual presentation of COVID, because COVID doesn't always present with the fever and the dry cough. So the study had the kind of surprise, if you like, of a diagnostic outcome. That's really quite important to understand. That quite often when you do these experiments, they do throw up surprises that may be different from the main hypothesis, where just the outcomes you're trying to measure turn out not to have the same pattern as you expected, and you can learn from that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the final study I'm going to show you. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I'm not. I'm going to tell you the second part of this study. This is very, very straightforward. We also tested these infographics on the right compared to bullet point information that was originally given for how to self-isolate. So these were guidelines on, if you have to self-isolate, what do you need to do? How do you manage your home? How do you deal with things like laundry and other stuff? So there was kind of 10 points. There was a 10-point plan in the booklet that was sent to all the households for how to self-isolate. We took the same information and we put it into infographics. Now, you might think those infographics on the right don't look much different from the bullet points on the left that were in the original booklet. One of the really interesting things about infographics is even giving people relatively cheap little cartoons to act as mnemonics like this. In some circumstances, it makes them more inclined to remember information better and also to process it better in the first place. And you wouldn't think like little things like cartoons and so on that are next to information will make the kind of difference they sometimes can, and sometimes they can. So we tested it in the COVID context. So here you have, obviously you've got the book, kind of the list that came in the booklet on the left. You've got the simple infographics on the right. We randomized people to see different types, and we then measured their recall and comprehension afterwards. So they got multiple choice questions where they had to recall the information, and they also had to answer questions that tested their understanding, whether they'd absorbed what they needed to do. So next slide, please. Again, an important part of this, we also asked people, how easy is the information to follow? And what you can see there is that actually our people thought the infographics, if anything, that's not a statistically significant difference, but if anything, were harder to follow. But in fact, they recalled more information, that's the middle chart there, and they had a higher multiple choice question score for understanding when they got the infographics, and those differences were statistically significant. So people didn't think that the infographics were giving the information any better than just the lists. In fact, they were absorbing more of the information and understanding it better. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, we've skipped on a few. I think we need to... Oh, no, yeah, that one's the correct one. Sorry, we're at the right one now. Apologies. Right, okay, so I've given you two examples. This is the final example. This is a pure diagnostic experiment. When we started to ease the restrictions on COVID, we were particularly interested in how people had absorbed the different risk factors, because what was going to be important as people started going about their social and economic business again was, could people recognize risk? Because we all were then in a situation where the responsibility was more on us to try to recognize when a situation was risky and balance that risk against what we're trying to achieve socially and economically in our lives. So as the restrictions were lifted, we wanted to see how well people had absorbed the public messaging about risk. And we did it like this. So this is a good example, I hope, because this is an online study which is purely diagnostic. So we're trying to see what's driving behavior. We weren't testing any kind of intervention, but it also shows what can be done. And we developed a lot of this over the period of the 7 studies, where because you're doing studies online, and we do it in an experimental environment, so this isn't just a survey where people are answering survey questions. We can do it very interactively. We can show them different images and we can get them to play with different tools. And in this case, we had them responding on a risk slider. So on our online interface, the people who came in to do the experiment, they get an example like this. So we would say how risky are certain social activities, and what we mean is the possibility you could get COVID-19 if you were to take part in them. And we would give them a social activity. And here's an example here where it says, keeping 2 meters from others is quite difficult. You're in a social circumstance where that's not easy to do. You're going to be there for 2 to 4 hours. It's indoors, and there are going to be 14 other people, and some of those people from different households. How risky would you see this to be? Now, obviously, in the current environment, the answer to that is pretty damn risky. But we have people use the slider here. And some of the examples were more risky and some of them were less risky. Some of them were 5 people meeting outdoors in a park where it was easy to socially distance and so on. And we gave people multiple scenarios and we had them use the slider to say, how risky would you view this scenario to be? Next slide, please. We also had them rank these risks. So that allowed us to put them against risks that people would come up against in everyday life. So what happens here is you've got the activities on the left and you had to read through all the activities, and then people could use their mouse and drag the activities and rank them from 1 to 8. So you'll see there that we've got meeting up with other people from different households indoors, meeting up with people from different households for a long time and so on. And then in there, we've also got not wearing a seatbelt while in a car, gambling with money needed for essential bills and so on. So we had people do a ranking task as well. So we had them looking at different social scenarios and rating the risk on sliders, and we had people ranking different kinds of risk as well. The key thing about this study was we didn't just do this with a representative sample of the Irish public, we also did it with a sample of Ireland's best experts on infectious disease, including many of the main people who sit on NEFIT undertook this for us. We had over 50 experts do the same experiment as a representative sample of the population. And what we wanted to do was compare what do the perceptions of risk for COVID look like between the experts and a representative sample of the population. So that tells us what of the messaging has really been absorbed, what have the public picked up accurately, and what have they maybe picked up not as accurately. So purely diagnostic study. So next slide, please. There we go. Now, again, I'm not going to go through this in great detail. I'm running over time a little bit because it's taken me slightly longer to explain some of this than I'd hoped. But the key thing that we found here was the biggest difference between the public and the expert group. And it's the 2 red circles there that I've got, one in particular. So I'll deal with duration first. So that there was a difference in duration that the experts would say, if you're with someone for half an hour versus 2 hours, it makes quite a big difference, more so than the public would. But by far the biggest difference we got between the public and the experts is what I've called location there. And what that is the difference between being indoors and outdoors. So the expert sample placed far greater weight. And what that chart is showing you is how much weight did they place on being indoors versus outdoors. And what you can see there is the experts placed far greater weight than the public did. Now, generally, that study was actually quite encouraging because you can see in most of the categories, the public's actually matched the experts really pretty well. They picked up that the number of people mattered, that how easy it was to socially distance mattered, that wearing a mask mattered. One of the things that was very interesting in this is we hypothesized that the public would place too much emphasis on themselves wearing a mask and not enough on everybody else wearing a mask. That hypothesis turned out to be wrong. Instead, we got a really big result that we didn't hypothesize and didn't expect, which is that what the public hadn't absorbed compared to the experts was the difference between being indoors and outdoors. So that directly could inform messaging where we had thought there was an issue about how masks were being messaged about. It actually turned out that the biggest difference there was about whether people were indoors versus outdoors. So this is an experiment that gives a surprising result, but it also gives a purely diagnostic response. We're testing no intervention there. We're just seeing what drives people's perceptions and decision making. And what we see is that the difference between indoors and outdoors hasn't been absorbed as much as it could be. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to summarize here some lessons from using behavioural experiments in the fight against COVID. And I'm going to go beyond COVID here. So I think we've learned a lot because we did these studies very rapidly in support of an emergency. We discovered that they can be done that rapidly. You really can do a full-on experiment and get proper results and design that experiment to answer a research question in an emergency situation or any situation if you really want to and you throw the resources at it really quite rapidly to pre-test interventions and give diagnostic information that's useful for designing better policy. I hope one of the things I've got across to you here, using these COVID examples and the earlier examples, is that experiments can do things that surveys simply cannot. For a long time, until about 10 years ago, primarily when we were looking at people's decisions and their behavior and how the public might interact with policies and public services and so on. Surveys are the predominant way of collecting data and information that researchers might analyze. Experiments can do things that surveys can't. And I hope what I've shown you here is that they can give more precise diagnoses of what's actually driving people's behavior. It would be extremely difficult to get some of the findings I've shown you from any kind of survey. You can test precise pre-tests of particular interventions and randomize some people to get the intervention, some people not, and actually measure whether it works in a way that, again, a survey couldn't give you. But because we can do experiments in these interactive environments, we can test capabilities, understanding, recall. We can have people using these kind of interactive sliders and so on. So the opportunity to really put the public through their paces in a particular policy area and really understand what they perceive and what's driving their behavior goes up using these experimental methods. But really importantly, quite often people will respond in surveys and in focus groups and in standard market research type responses, and they will tell you stuff that turns out not to be true. So in our studies, as I showed you, people thought that some of these posters wouldn't work. They thought that they weren't getting information any better from the infographics than not. But actually, when we measured it, they were wrong. When we actually measured it, it was having a bigger influence on them. They just didn't realize it. People often don't know why they make the decisions they do and why they behave the way they do. And experiments can uncover that in a way that just asking them cannot. And the final slide, please. I just want to make some broader points about innovation. So I'm talking about one specific innovation. It's the area I know about. It's applying behavioral science to policy. But my experience of doing that, I mean, the last 7 years, as I said, we've gone from starting up a lab down at the ESRI. We now have this behavioral research unit that's working for about a dozen agencies and departments, and there's 8 full-time staff in it. One of the things you discover, I think, and I've put a few things down here, but it certainly takes courage to be first, and I'm going to be forever grateful to the particular public servants who were the first to jump with us and start doing these kind of experiments. Once we started doing it with a few, became so much easier to get people interested and get them to realize that doing this kind of experimental work could be really beneficial. And one of the reasons is because you can demonstrate it. Once I could start showing people findings, as I've shown you today, and demonstrating how we do it in one area, people became much more confident about being willing to then do it in another area. And what that tells you is that quite often, I mean, sure, attitude and openness to innovation matters, but an awful lot of it is about just having the knowledge and the confidence to believe that this is something that's really worth pursuing and that you're able and as well as willing to do it. People need to feel confident in what they're doing, willing to, and I'm sure during Innovation Week we'll hear a lot about willingness to take risks and it being okay to be wrong and it being okay to take a risk that's not always going to work. And these are important aspects of any kind of innovation policy. That's certainly been our experience. But I think confidence to push ahead is one of the things that's really important in people's willingness to take a risk. And where we could show people what we've done in other areas and demonstrate the power of the kind of experiments that we're using, we found that really made a difference to people's willingness to engage with us and maybe start doing some experiments in some other policy areas where they could be really useful. So I hope that's prompted a decent number of questions and some conversation. I've run over time a little bit, and thanks very much for listening.
Yeah. Sorry, am I on? Yeah, sorry. Well, thank you very much, Pete. I think that was very, very interesting. And I suppose for all of us listening to your presentation, Pete, we're all reflecting on where this kind of work and behavioural science and behavioural research is applicable to our own jobs and to our own areas of work. And it seems to me that across the civil and the public service, that really when we're developing policy, you know, it's really important that we do that kind of research to find that our policy is the right policy and that it is targeted. And equally, when we're implementing policy, that there is, you know, some sort of way of looking to see, are we influencing people and are we communicating in the right way? But Pete, we're now going to open it up to questions. We have quite a large audience, and we invite you to ask your questions on the chat function. And I know that Breda behind the scenes here is taking those questions for you, Pete. But I might start with one or two myself, Pete. And it's this, I know you mentioned it a couple of times. You mentioned about surprises, surprises that, you know, you might have thought that people would behave in a particular way, or people might think in a particular way before you did the experiment, before you did the research, whether it's in COVID or otherwise, and then you found something quite different. So maybe you might expand a little bit more of where you found these surprises and the importance of doing the research and doing the work behind the scenes.
Almost every experiment I've ever done has surprised me. Even if the main hypotheses hold, there's nearly always things that come up in the data that you don't anticipate, and you end up looking at more carefully and thinking about harder. And nearly always that is educational and instructive. Nearly always you learn something from it you didn't expect to learn. Now, that in many ways is a really good thing. As a scientist, that's one of the things that makes me do what I do. It's exciting and it makes my job fun. As a policymaker, I can understand that might leave you with some trepidation, because it means that you have to accept the notion of doubt, that the assumptions you're making and the policy that is your kind of pet idea at the moment, if you run experiments, they may tell you that the mechanism you're trying to target, that the pet policy you have at the moment, that the way you think you should be doing it at the moment just isn't right. It just doesn't work. And that when you do the experiment, you need to be thinking some other way. Now, I would say actually most of the experiments we run tend to show that the kind of prevailing policy idea might well work, but that it depends how you do it. So calorie posting is a perfect example of that, where the government's been committed to calorie posting for some time. I suspect had it not been for COVID, that legislation might even be in by now. But what our experiment showed was a surprising thing about it really mattered exactly what the kind of spatial arrangement of the information was, or whether it was going to have an impact on what people ordered and ate. So it can throw up surprises that make you have to adapt as you go, but that's exactly why you do it. You have to be open to that doubt, because if you're not, potentially you're committing to something which the study will show is not going to have the kind of level of impact that it could have or would have. And that's exactly why it's sensible to pre-test it, because otherwise we expend all of the resources putting that system in place. We discover after the fact that it's not as powerful as we thought.
In terms of being at the center of the current decision making, the current crisis, and trying to influence all of the people and all of the different stakeholders who are trying to manage the crisis for us. One of the things I suppose you probably encounter is a certain amount of resistance. In other words, you do the research, you find the evidence, it's pretty compelling, and yet people will say, well, hold on a sec, I don't really believe that. I think I don't feel that that's the case. And I heard an interview with you recently. I think it was on one of the morning shows, and somebody was exactly saying that. Well, that's not my sense, and I'm hearing different things. So how do you cope with that, and particularly in the current climate, when you're dealing with a lot of different people on NEFIT, a lot of different policymakers, and there's a huge amount of people involved in this? How do you deal with that resistance, and how do you overcome it?
So anyone who was at the innovation event last year will know that the thing I say is that I used to think as a scientist I spread knowledge, and I now realize that I spread doubt. One of the biggest things, if you provide evidence for policy, is to get people to accept initially that they might be wrong and to subject their ideas to test. Now, I think experiments do that more than survey research does, because survey research is open to more interpretation precisely because people might not be telling you the truth. Whereas if you run an experiment and you actually measure people's behavior, or you measure their perceptions or their ability to make a decision, you get a much more concrete answer about, what effect is this actually having. And the only reason to run an experiment is if you're prepared to accept that the results might go either way. Now, I would argue that although it might be painful to discover that a policy, or let's say it's a regulation that people have put a lot of time and effort into getting to a kind of design phase, and then if we pre-test it in an experiment and it turns out not to work, that's really disappointing for the people who put the time and effort into it. But it's also extremely disappointing, and probably more disappointing, if we go ahead and we roll that out without testing whether it works, and we spend all of the money and all of the implementation money and all of the staff time that's involved in that and all of the materials and paperwork and so on for something that actually, had we pre-tested it experimentally, we'd have discovered wouldn't work. That's quite an extreme example, though. The one more point I want to make to you is that's not most of the time what happens in our studies. Most of the time what happens is we realize that a policy that we might be considering implementing, that small tweaks can make quite large differences to how effective it is. And one of the things an experiment can show you is what's the right kind of settings, how to set the dials of the policy, if you like, to tweak it so that it's going to be more likely to be effective.
Now, thank you, Pete. Now, I'm going to go over to Breda to get the questions from our audience. So, Breda, I'll hand over to yourself, and you might just take some of those questions.
I'll start with one from Philip. He's asked, how can we use behavioural insights for climate action? Car use, public transport uptake. What can we do? What can we do to use behavioural insights in this case?
That's a great question. It happens that I'm on Friday going to a conference organised by the European Commission that is asking exactly that question about what we've learned from COVID that can be applied behaviourally to the climate change issue. My lab is doing some work now on climate change. We are trying to study how important understanding of the actual scientific process of climate change is for people's willingness to change their behaviour. We're ongoing about that at the moment. The answer to the question, though, is there's very many things that behavioural science might teach us, and I'm obviously conscious there's other questions here, so I'm just going to home in on one, which is the one I would see as being the biggest one potentially that transfers over from COVID, and that's this, that I think one of the things that the response to this disease has taught many of us is the possibility, if we coordinate ourselves right and we get the communication right, which obviously through the crisis we've done better at some stages than others, but when we get it right, it is remarkable actually how much people are willing to coordinate their behavior, how much they're willing to make sacrifices and changes to their lives for the greater good. And I think there's a real question as to whether one can harness that post-COVID to tackle some of the biggest problems of our age, like climate change, like antimicrobial resistance, like childhood obesity. I mean, because that insight is relevant and the behaviours involved are relevant for all of those policy issues that we will return to, hopefully, when we've got through this crisis. So I'll leave it there, but I think it's a really, really good question, and it's an active question. Hopefully I'm going to know more by 3 o'clock on Friday about that than I know now.
We'll bring you back then, so Pete. So there's so many and lots of comments, such as T. O'Byrne, who said, thanks, Professor Lunn, very interesting presentation. I might jump to Ashley's question. So she's asking, should behavioural insights be used more before a service is launched to the public? And then has asked, are there any courses public servants can take to gain more knowledge in this area? And just before you answer, Pete, I might just note that my colleagues in the Reform and Delivery division of DEEPR are actually working on developing some courses in behavioural insights, which I'm sure you know about, Pete, that will be launched in 2021. So keep an eye on ops2020.gov.ie for more information on that. Sorry, Pete, go ahead.
You're fine. Can I just check, because you dropped out slightly on me at the start of that question, was the question about whether before we roll out a new service we should test it? Was that the first part?
Yes, exactly. So should behavioural insights be used more before a service is launched to the public?
You'd be unsurprised to hear a behavioural scientist answer that question with a straightforward yes. I yet to the public service that was launching something where there were not opportunities for behavioural science to at least tweak and improve it here and there, and in some cases fully test it. So, I mean, I presented actually at this conference last year an example where we fully tested the latest regulation on energy pricing and trying to make energy pricing fairer and more transparent for consumers. And we could fully test, we pre-tested fully the regulation before it rolled out to see whether it, for example, improved people's accuracy in perceiving the value of energy products when they were advertised on billboards and so on. And we could actually test that before it was rolled out and then tweak it accordingly, which we did. So, I mean, the short answer to the question is just yes. Nearly always there are things that we can do and that will strengthen the rollout if we test them beforehand. On the issue to do with training, for 3 years now I've done a 2-day training course for European civil servants in Brussels, which is oversubscribed and which is going pretty well, I think. And as you know, we were going to do a one-day version of that in Ireland starting this year, and COVID has pushed that out, I guess. But me and my team certainly want to do more of it. I should keep stressing we're not the only behavioural science team in Ireland. There are others as well. But I mean, we certainly think that it's not just a question of us doing research, but it's a question of people understanding what this new approach to doing applied behavioural science policy can do. And so we're more than willing to do sessions like this, and also to devise and run training courses to try and get people up to speed on how they might use experimental methods.
Thanks, Pete. And just to reiterate that my colleagues Philip and Hilary are working on a suite of L&D interventions related to innovation. So keep an eye on our website and social media for that. The next question is from Lisa Higgins. She said, thanks, Pete, for the nice overview. She said, great examples of researchers engaged in evidence-based policy making. She wonders how we can incentivize more of this linkage across both social sciences and STEM-based sciences.
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm not totally sure what she's getting at by incentivize, but let me give you a take on it. I mean, I think one of the real questions here is, are scientists like me appropriately incentivized to engage and really get involved in trying to improve policy and public services? The answer to that is no. Too many scientists like me are rewarded for producing international journal publications that may or may not be relevant to humanity. I choose to work in research for policy because I'd rather do work that is relevant for humanity. But sometimes I actually find I'm incentivized more to do stuff that is not directly applicable than stuff that is. So there are problems with academic incentives there, and I think we need to reward researchers more for getting their hands dirty and getting stuck into practical issues. And I would advocate that that's an important thing. As for the public service, I think it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that's great about my job is you get to interact with multiple people in multiple organizations. I've now done work with, I guess it's probably somewhere around 20 to 25 different departments and agencies. One of the things that makes you really do is it makes you realize how diverse our public servants actually are. So whenever I hear generalizations made on the radio or written about in the paper about, oh, they only care about this or they're only incentivized by this, I know it's nonsense, because there's an enormous diversity of attitudes and incentives and reasons why people get out of bed in the morning and do what they do and try to affect the change that they do. But I do think there's nevertheless some power in the question about the incentives that we have, because there is a central issue about our willingness to reward people doing things a little bit differently and taking some risks, and whether people have got the wherewithal to do that and the support to do that. And I think that is an important issue that too often people feel like, I don't know whether it's true or not, but they certainly feel like engaging people like us might be a more high risk thing to do, and that if it doesn't go well, they might suffer as a result. And that's particularly important if you engage in experimental work, because you genuinely don't know what you're going to find. And you might find stuff that causes you a policy headache, and you need to hope that everyone around you is going to be supportive and open to the possibility that it's a headache. But I mean, I'm always going to argue it's better to know the truth than not know the truth about whether something's going to work.
I'm with you there. So there's one here now from Alan O'Neill. Pete, if and when, he's put in brackets, the vaccine comes, how much can we leverage behavioural science to get us to the level of herd efficacy?
I would argue a lot. So off the top of my head, I'd say, I mean, there's an argument even for doing some work and commissioning some work on this now, where we would do some investigative work on people's current perceptions of the vaccine, how confident they are that it's safe, how that breaks down by socio-demographic group. Rather than just run a survey, I would want to run one of our kind of interactive diagnostic studies where we would give people different hypothetical scenarios and get them responding and rating to them to see how they're likely to respond, depending what kind of communication surrounds the development of a vaccine, where it's been developed. I suspect people will respond very differently if it turns out that this Oxford vaccine works than if one comes from somewhere they haven't heard of, for example, because we know that when people consider taking risks in their lives, they're much more comfortable to take risks with things that feel more familiar. So if people have heard quite a lot more about where this is coming from for a number of months, they're probably going to be more confident interacting with it than if it suddenly comes at them from somewhere somewhere else, a new story, for example. These are all things that potentially we could test and test pretty soon, so that you'd have a real idea about how to communicate effectively with people. I think the other thing that's really important, is likely to be really important, is getting the science communication right, so that we spread understanding of how a vaccine in theory works if we all do sign up for it and get it, assuming we do get trials that tell us a vaccine is safe and that we can push ahead. One of the real innovations that's happened in the communication over COVID in recent weeks, and you'll have noticed this, there's a good one running today, is that we've started telling stories, narratives about how infection is spreading, and putting those into the public communications, not just numbers and advice on what to do and what not to do, but stories of specific instances, usually anonymized, but well, in fact always anonymized, but stories of how specific instances have caused the virus to spread in certain ways. That's a really important part of science communication. It always pains me as a scientist to admit this, but one of the classic findings of behavioral science is that people are more persuaded by narrative than they are by statistics. And I think we're now starting to use that in the communication. And when it comes to the vaccine, that's going to be really, really important, that we give people a thorough understanding and we use the best science communication we can, which does involve narrative about how a vaccine works, why it's so important, and why we all have to pull together to make it effective. So there's a lot in there. Sorry, that's not a short answer, but it's a very good question.
No, that makes sense. And I've actually personally noticed those stories over the last few weeks. Today, with that chap who'd been on holidays and back to 36 people or something, and then
it's amazing. I've been watching it. They go to the top of the most read list on most of the online news sites. So there was the one about the couple who spread it because they're a very sociable couple over a weekend, and then we've got this latest one about the traveller and so on. And yeah, I mean, and it's not just because people are more interested in stories in the sense they might be interested in sort of tabloid stories and gossip. It's because the stories contain causal chains that allow us to understand processes. And that's why narrative is so important, because so much of the human brain is actually wired not to process things like abstract mathematics and statistics, but to process how one thing leads to another. Because we existed in a world of narrative for as long as we.
I can tell you, my brain does not respond well to abstract mathematics, but it did stop me in my tracks when I heard that on Morning Ireland this morning with that narrative. It definitely makes a difference. I might push on to another question from Keith Ashmore. This is an interesting perspective. Is it not the case from experiments carried out that essentially the public can be manipulated to give any message governments choose to push? So what are the ethical parameters to be used by government-appointed behavioural scientists?
That's a great question. People have written whole papers about this, including me. And so I can only respond quite briefly. My own view about this is that there are real issues about using behavioural science responsibly. I think we have to use it transparently and openly and publish everything. We don't only publish everything we do, we actually even pre-register the study designs and host them online so that when the results come in, we then release all of the original plans for how we're going to hypothesize and run the study. So we try to do it as transparently and openly as we possibly can. But I think the other thing is you have to be really careful about what are your criteria for a good decision. So every study we run, we ultimately come down to saying, well, look, if there's policy implications from this, we're saying that a particular way of presenting the information or a particular way of setting out the environment or giving people advice, if it's changing people's behavior and decisions, is it doing it for the better? What are our criteria for saying that we are improving people's behavior or helping them to make better decisions? And I think every study we run, that's an important question that we have to answer from an ethical standpoint before we run the study. So, what is it we're actually trying to achieve? And can we stand over this as saying this is good for people? Because it's absolutely clear that the kind of results that we produce do allow you to change people's decisions and behaviors. That's what this science does. And that's the genie's out of the bottle in that we've always known that governments can do that. But what's happening here is that it's getting put on a stronger scientific footing. Well, if we're going to do that, we have to do that really responsibly. And yeah, as I said, I think transparency and being very clear about what your criterion for helping people is are two of the things you can do. But what I've done there is I've summarized what is an enormous academic research literature on the ethical use of behavioral science.
Very well, thank you.
I think the most important.
There's another similar type of question from Simon Kelly. Childhood obesity is a major epidemic due to happen in Ireland. Is there a way to use this mechanism on kids, and is it ethical? Can nudges make people get up and run or play sports?
So we have, let me use an example. We've just run a study which is about to be published, and hopefully you'll hear about some of this in the public domain because we'll press release it and hope we get a bit of pickup. I mean, who knows, depends what's happening on COVID on the day, but we've just run a study that's about to be published where we did involve children in the following sense, that we had gift packs delivered to homes that contained snacks where we had doctored the packaging. We doctored the packaging. And we basically put stripes on some of the packaging, which we'd had printed professionally, so it looked like the snack company had done it, showing what an appropriate portion size of the snacks was. And we found that if you actually put visual cues, so at the moment you get it in a little nutritional table that says what's the serving size, and then what's an appropriate portion size, and you have to do some maths with the numbers and compare it with the weight of the packet to ever know how many biscuits you should have, for example. I mean, who does that? Nobody does that. So what a behavioral scientist would do is say, well, look, is there a way that we can make that much easier for people? And we just thought, well, look, why not just put stripes on packets and say, look, this is a portion. Right? So we tried it, and we ran a randomized controlled trial where, as I said, we gave these gift packs to people, some of which had the snacks. And these were things that went to family homes where we could look at the impact in families that had children as to how many chocolate biscuits they ate and this kind of stuff. And we found it made a difference. If you give people the cues, then they were more likely to control. In fact, they were less likely to open the packet at all, and they were more likely then to eat less. Or eat more slowly. It's not that they letting it go to waste, it's just that they weren't going through the packet as rapidly. So it had some impact. I think behavioral science has a huge amount to offer for childhood obesity, but it's a slow process. There's no silver bullet here. I mean, it's about developing multiple interventions to try to make the environment one in which parents can make better decisions for their kids. Parents are incredibly busy. They do not have time to read nutritional labels on the back of everything in a supermarket. We've got to find ways to intervene and help them make better decisions in a more simple way. Our study is just one of what will end up being hundreds that try to get at this problem. Ultimately, it will then come down, if I'm completely honest, to when the behavioral science shows what needs to be done, are we willing to take on the food companies?
And just in terms of that, the ethical part of that question, I know you've addressed the ethical part of behavioral science in your previous answer, but in terms of applying this to children, is there a different sort of ethical framework to think about?
So I guess for that, that's a good example then. So from an ethical point of view for that study, we stood over the study by saying, look, it is the case that overwhelmingly children are eating too many snack foods. We are going to test an intervention here which has the potential to reduce the amount of snack foods that they are eating. That is manipulating people's choices by putting our stripes on the packet, but we'll stand over that the choices they make are going to be on average good for the kids that are involved. So we'll do it. And we'll provide evidence for a policy that potentially would turn around to the food companies and say, this is something you should be doing, because this will make it easier for parents to know how much of a snack food to give to their kids that's healthy. Now, I'm going to stand over that from an ethical point of view, but I fully accept that I'm manipulating people's decisions by designing an intervention that's changing the way parents give their kids food in the household. You have to take on board what you are doing. And in that case, I'm more than happy ethically to do that and be transparent that that's what we're doing. And that comes back to the point I made earlier. You've got to have a criterion for why what you're doing is okay, is reasonable, and is not causing harm, is actually causing benefit, and then be open and transparent about what you're doing. And for that study, that's what we're doing. So from an ethical point of view, again, the same things apply. But it's a good question because every time you have to really stop and think.
Yeah. So just two short questions before I think we've run out of time. I'm actually over, but I could talk to you all day, Pete, about this stuff. So Anne Rebo O'Reilly was asking in relation to the COVID posters, what size sample were you talking about there?
That study we ran on, I think it was 500 to 600. I'm talking from memory here, but I think it was a sample of 500 to 600 that were randomized into each group. So we had somewhere between 150 and 200 in each group who responded to the posters. There's an important point to make here. Experiments can run on smaller sample sizes than surveys do. The primary reason that surveys run on sample sizes of 1,000 is not because you need 1,000 to measure something accurately. It's because you actually need about 200 to measure something accurately. And surveys need to break things down by social groups, things like age and gender and socioeconomic status. If you look at a standard error curve, typically you can measure something pretty accurately off around 200. So we usually use samples in our experiments where each condition that we randomize people into would have at least that kind of. However, sometimes you're interested in effects that might be much smaller than that. So, for example, where we're trying to alter environmental behaviors, even getting a change of 2 or 3% on a pollution rate is a really good impact. And then you might have to run studies on thousands. So the farmers study, for example, that we've run on absolutely thousands of farmers that have been randomized to get different letters. So you pick your sample size depending on what effect size you're trying to measure. And obviously all these samples, you try and make them as representative as possible.
Una is asking, how trustworthy are survey replies?
It depends. It depends how well the survey question's been designed. It depends whether the survey includes questions that are precisely designed to catch whether people are telling the truth or not. I often think that people respond what they think is truthfully because they don't know themselves what drives their own behavior. And I think you'll see there are examples in my presentation there where people think they're not being influenced by something and actually they are. That's just what we are like as human beings. We don't have perfect insight into what actually motivates us and decides things one way or another, because so much of what happens to us is either unconscious or operates at an emotional level that's quite hard to articulate. So I think one of the really interesting things about COVID actually is that people will tell you that they're not responding necessarily because they're scared of the disease, and actually they are. And we can see that in quite a lot of the data. So we don't always know what our real kind of base motivations are. So I'm always going to be suspicious of a survey response in the sense that I'm going to interrogate, other reasons to want to have some nuance here. But overwhelmingly, I use survey data. Survey data is highly instructive. What people say about what they're doing is a really important indicator of what they're doing and how they feel. You just need multiple methods to really understand what's driving behavior, and particularly decision-making. I mean, I think surveys are very good for doing things like, if you want to know how many people have been physically active in the last week, and you take people through and you get them to detail exactly what they've done in the last week, they might exaggerate a little bit, but you're probably going to measure it pretty accurately. And particularly if you break it down by things like gender and social group, the differences you get will be meaningful. You might overestimate a little because people want to make themselves look a little better, but it'll be pretty good. So surveys are very, very useful. But if I want to really understand what's driving decision making, I'm going to want to run an experiment.
Okay, our time is up, Pete. For the audience, you'll find all of Pete and his colleagues' papers on the ESRI website. Really great website with lots of sort of bulletins and full papers. So I definitely think to learn more, go there. And as I said, keep an eye out on our website, ops2020.ie, for news of our behavioural science interventions, L&D interventions next year. And so I'm going to pass over to Dr. Lucy Fallon-Byrne, who will make some closing remarks for this session. And thanks again, Pete.
Thanks very much, Breda. I think we could go on for a very long time. I have a lot of questions in my own head, Pete, and this is a really, really interesting topic. I keep asking myself the question is, why are our behaviours so much different now than they were in March, for example? And I'm sure you'll have great insights into that. But I suppose just to close, I think we've had a great start to our Innovation Week, and I just want to extend a very, very big thank you to you, Pete. You're an extremely busy man. You're very much in demand at the moment in terms of the crisis, but you're also running a very, very active and very energetic unit in the ESRI. And I think for this morning, for all of our members who have joined us this morning, you can see the value of this and you can see the potential. And I know that you can start looking at your own areas and seeing where this can be applied. And I know that Pete and the team are available there for to get in touch with if there are areas that you want to experiment with, and if you want some guidance and some consultation. So it's great to have this morning and have the last hour or two to showcase what can be done, Pete, because I think it has enormous potential in the public service, because all of our work is about making decisions, making policies for our public, and communicating that and trying to influence and lead behaviour. And, you know, it's hugely, hugely applicable. So a very, very big thanks to you, Pete. It is really, really appreciated. And also, I suppose, thank you very much for what you do in terms of guiding us through this crisis, which is, you know, it's causing so much worry for everybody. But the work that you are doing is very, very helpful. And indeed, I suppose, on behalf of us all, I just want to say thank you for what you do and the kind of insights you give, because I think we all do really appreciate it. And then just to say, in terms of Innovation Week itself, as Breda said, there's a very diverse programme across the whole week. And this week is designed, I suppose, to showcase the great work we're doing in innovation, but also to help us to innovate further and to provide the supports for that. And just to say to you that today, for example, we're launching a framework, an innovation strategy framework. One of the things we've learned about innovation is that you cannot innovate without a plan. It has to be planned, there has to be a strategy, there has to be a purpose, and it has to be clear. So we have developed a framework for you to use, and we'll be launching that, and we're discussing it this afternoon and launching it very shortly, and we'll be sharing it with you. And we hope that all of you in your statements of strategy that are now going to be developed following the new government, you can input that into your strategy so that we can have a kind of a very powerful focus on innovation in going forward. As Robert said, you know, we really need to be responding to the changes that are happening around us, and we need to be responding to the uncertainty and to our customer needs. And without innovation, we're not able to do that. We also, as you know, have, just to be aware that, as Breda said, the team is there. Breda leads an innovation team, and they have a range of training and supports available for you if you need it. They also run master classes, and they run a very active network of 800 people across the public service. So there's a lot of supports there for you if you want to engage further. But I suppose for this week, it's suffice to say that, you know, engage with us and get on to some of these different programs for the week. And it's not just ourselves that are running these. There are a widespread number of events happening across all of the different sectors in the public service. And, you know, it's really, really wonderful to see this, and wonderful to see it at this particular time in our lives when things are entirely different and a lot more, I suppose, a lot more worrisome and anxious for many of us. So it's great to see that we have delivered so well in the public service, and it's great to see that we can have a week like this where we can reflect on what we're doing and really help us to do everything better at the end. And I also want to just finish then by thanking Breda and the team and our supporters here behind the scenes. We have Breda and Vinny and Laura and the entire innovation team and Philip. They're a really, really great team, and they couldn't be more helpful if you want to get support from them. So I'm going to close there now, and just to say a very big thank you to you, the audience, for engaging with us this morning. I hope you got benefit from it. I certainly did. And, you know, I can't imagine a better start than having Pete's presentation and the great insights that he's given us. The very best of luck for the rest of the week, and thank you very much.